Pleased now to welcome to the set Nigerian journalist and Daily Beast correspondent Philip Obaji. So, Philip, welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Now, before we start to talk about your work, I want to talk about the developing situation in Mali. So, as we heard, the Tuareg rebels said they made a deal to allow the Russian mercenaries there. I guess it's now part of the Africa Corps to leave. So, at this point, how effective would you say Wagner's new Africa Corps has been in Mali, and how effective have they been in supporting the junta and allegedly providing security?
Well, they haven't had too many gains in northern Mali. And if you look a couple of years back, there were also many casualties that the Russians suffered during an attack between the JNIM, that's the Al Qaeda backed militia group, and Wagner paramilitaries. So over 80 Russians were killed in that attack. But we haven't seen so much of impact since the Russians came into the north of Mali, replacing French forces, obviously. What we have seen is numerous reports of atrocities, abuses, and even massacres across Mali. But in terms of gaining full control of very important towns and communities, we haven't seen too much gains.
Now, as I said, you've focused much of your reporting career on following Wagner and now the Africa Corps and what's been happening across the continent. What made you want to begin to report on their activities in the first place?
Oh, it's very important. Well, we'll go back to 2018 when 3 Russian journalists who had traveled to the Central African Republic to report on the operations of Wagner mercenaries were killed in the central part of the country. So my editor at the time, the late Christopher Dickey, reached out to me and asked if I could look into the activities of these journalists, what they did in the country, in the days before they were killed. And that was the first time I was actually looking into any sort of operations by Wagner paramilitaries anywhere in Africa. And so I began to make phone calls. I called a few contacts in the Central African Armed Forces, a few other contacts in civil society. And then I started to ask them, what did you know? Do you know somebody who knows somebody? But in the course of this investigation, I found a lot about the Wagner group that needed more in-depth investigation. Like, where exactly are they deployed in the country? Questions like, what's asking them to do what they're doing? Is Prigozhin really behind the funding of this group? And that's how it began. And in the years that followed, I uncovered massive amounts of human rights abuses, massive amounts of disinformation that Wagner was helping to spread in the Central African Republic. And later I began to look at Mali, where Russian paramilitaries were deployed in many areas to help the government fight against jihadist and Tuareg separatists.
As you were mentioning about your friend, an occupational hazard, taking on some stories like this. You've also had some close calls. You've seen firsthand what these Russian mercenaries can do. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with them?
Well, I have only met one-on-one with Russian paramilitaries once, and that was far back as in 2023, not so far away though. And that was when I traveled to the northern part of the country to find out exactly what was happening in the country after the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. I mean, there were so many questions around the world. What will be of the Wagner group after Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash near Moscow? And I knew that for anyone to know the future of Wagner, that person will have to look into what happens in the Central African Republic. And so I made the trip into the Central African Republic by road from Nigeria to Cameroon, and from Cameroon to the northwest of the Central African Republic. Well, as I tried to do an interview, on the border with Cameroon, I got to witness one of the most brutal actions ever taken on a journalist when about 4 Central African soldiers rushed me and had their batons and whips on me. And amongst them were 2 Russian paramilitaries who I saw, ordering the Central African soldiers to manhandle me. So it's my first close call or first close association in terms of witnessing or seeing the Russian paramilitaries give an order. But I have spoken to dozens of witnesses who have explained exactly how these mercenaries have attacked their communities, how they have raped men and women, how they have tortured young people, and how they have detained even people who are old and unable to even function very well.
That must have been incredibly nerve-wracking. Now, the stories, the massacres you've reported on, the other human rights abuses, what was the toughest one for you to cover?
Well, it was on my last trip, to the Central African Republic, where I spoke to dozens of victims of rape. Now, in a town called Boa, which is the biggest city in the northwest of the Central African Republic, dozens of girls were arrested, detained in a military facility in Boa, where they were raped systematically. Some of them were administered contraceptives after being raped. And those who got pregnant had their fetuses aborted by these Russian paramilitaries. So they were the most disturbing stories. I also spoke to girls who were raped on their farmlands in the Central African Republic. But every story I've heard, whether it's in the Central African Republic or in Mali, have been very difficult to listen to, and they've been very emotional, even for me.
Philip, thank you so much for being with us today, telling us a little bit more about your work. I wish you continued success on your dangerous reports. That's Philip Obaji, a Nigerian journalist and Daily Beast correspondent speaking.